He had everything: power, wealth, and a heart locked behind years of silence. Until one rainy night, when death was just seconds away, a little girl in a wheelchair reached out her hand and saved him. What started as an impossible rescue became the unraveling of a truth he never saw coming. Because sometimes fate doesn't just save your life, it rewrites it. And when the past returns in the form of a child with secrets in her eyes, what will he do when he learns who she really is? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. This is another beautiful tale from Mr. Edward's Tales, where you feel the real emotion of stories that make you reflect on life. Richard Hale never liked silence, not the kind that creeps in during late nights in high-rise penthouses or the sterile pauses between boardroom arguments. He filled his life with sound: market alerts, phone calls, the hum of jets, the clinking of glasses at meetings that didn't matter. But that night, the silence wasn't metaphorical. It was real. It was mechanical. It started with a single wrong feeling in his foot. He pressed the brake pedal as the rain poured in angry streaks across his windshield, expecting the familiar resistance. Instead, the pedal sank to the floor like it was made of wet paper. No resistance, no slowdown, just a terrible, soft squish followed by nothing. His mouth went dry. He pressed again, harder. Still nothing. The speedometer climbed as the curve in the road approached too fast. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, trying to steer into the curve, trying to compensate, but the tires had already lost their grip. The road blurred, and so did everything else. His heart pounded once, twice, then stopped reacting. The last thought that crossed his mind with any clarity was one of brutal simplicity. The brakes don't work. And then the world flipped. The car spun, steel shrieked, and silence finally came, in the form of a crash that felt like punishment. There was no gradual return to awareness, just pain, sharp, immediate, and total. Richard blinked slowly, eyes struggling to focus past the spiderweb of shattered windshield glass. He was still strapped in barely, the seatbelt now a painful line across his ribs. Blood filled his mouth, thick and metallic, as if his body had turned against him in one last betrayal. He couldn't move his legs, and his left hand was pinned. But something in him, something not entirely dead yet, told him not to close his eyes. He stared ahead at the slanted outline of the road and tried to breathe through pain and panic. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that he was dying, alone, on a highway. After building an empire, after commanding rooms and shifting markets, it would all end here, in a broken vehicle under the rain. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply stared at the broken dashboard and accepted the weight of it. That is, until something shifted outside his window. A figure approached, small, slow, determined. At first, he thought it was a hallucination, some trick his brain was playing as it shut down. But then he heard it, light wheels gliding over the pavement, a small voice calling out, soft but clear, like a thread tugging him back from the dark. "Sir?" the voice said. It was a child, definitely a child, but not panicked, not screaming, just calm. "Sir, can you hear me?" He wanted to say yes, wanted to shout, wanted to move, but his body betrayed him. The blood in his lungs made a gurgling sound instead. His vision blurred again, then cleared, and that's when he saw her, really saw her. A young girl, maybe 6 or 7 years old, wearing a bright yellow raincoat too big for her shoulders. Her blonde hair was stuck to her face, soaked, but she didn't seem to care. She sat in a wheelchair, one of those newer ones, lightweight and sleek, and navigated over the broken glass and wet pavement like she'd done it 1,000 times. He watched in disbelief as she reached his window, barely flinching at the shards. "I'm going to help," she said, not asking, not wondering, declaring. Then she leaned forward and, with delicate fingers, reached through the shattered glass and placed her hand directly over his chest. Her hand was small, warm, steady. He felt the press of it through the pain and the cold. like an anchor. "You can't sleep yet," she whispered. "You have to stay awake, okay?" The way she spoke, it wasn't just the words, it was the tone. A strange familiarity coated her every syllable. Her voice didn't sound like a child's voice should sound in that situation. There was no fear, no confusion, just calm insistence. Her hand never trembled. Richard's body wanted to give in to the pull of unconsciousness, but her words kept jarring him back to the surface. Then, without even knowing why, a chill ran through him. Because she wasn't just saying anything, she was saying something he knew. "Truth whispers quietly," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Listening saves souls from lies." Richard's eyes widened despite the pain. Those exact words. His late wife, Anna, used to write them in her journal. A phrase she'd coined and repeated, scrawled beside drawings of the daughter they never got to raise. A phrase no one else had ever said aloud, but her. The girl didn't stop talking. "You have to listen," she said again. "Even when everything else is loud." She didn't know it, but her words were dragging him back from the edge, forcing breath back into his lungs, light into his vision, and will into his collapsing body. Her hand was like a spark against the numbness. Richard tried to speak again, and this time something like a syllable emerged. She didn't celebrate. She simply nodded, eyes locked on his, unwavering. Her gaze didn't flicker to the blood or the wreckage or the bent metal pinning his arm. She focused entirely on his face, like she was willing him to stay alive by force of belief. "You're doing good," she said softly. "That's it. Just breathe slow. Look at me, not the pain." He hated how fragile his body felt, how helpless he was, but some part of him, a part buried under decades of cold logic and polished control, surrendered to her voice. It felt like Anna's voice had come back through this girl's mouth. It was impossible, unexplainable, but completely real. "Don't worry about the sirens," she added gently. "They're almost here." And indeed, in the distance, faint flashing lights blurred through the rain. The girl didn't look away, though. Not until an adult voice called out, frantic, sharp, terrified. "Clara, Clara, stop!" The girl turned her head slightly, and Richard caught the name. Clara. She was already being pulled back. Someone, a woman, scooped her up from the wheelchair and held her tight. But Clara's hand stayed on his chest for a moment longer. "Stay awake," she repeated. As the paramedics finally reached him and began shouting instructions and cutting through the wreckage, Richard's mind spun in loops. He couldn't stop hearing her voice, couldn't stop replaying the surreal familiarity of her words. The stretcher was a blur. The oxygen mask, the straps, the pain. He barely registered any of it. All he could think about was that child's steady hand, her whispered phrases, and the cold shock of realizing she had somehow spoken truths no one else could have known. Not the doctors, not his team, no one. She had said Anna's words. The words he'd buried, locked away in grief so deep, he'd forgotten what they felt like when spoken aloud. And somehow, this small, wheelchair-bound girl had known them, had offered them to him like a lifeline. As the ambulance doors closed and he stared at the roof, willing himself to hold on, he thought not of his company, or the accident, or the looming questions of sabotage. He thought only of Clara, of her face, of her voice, and the impossible realization that somehow a girl he had never seen before had just saved his life with the words of the woman he still loved. Words that only she had ever said. Richard didn't remember regaining consciousness. One moment there was blackness, thick and final, and the next there were harsh fluorescent lights pressing against his eyelids and the faint but constant beep of machines keeping score of his fragile survival. At first, he thought he might still be dreaming, another hallucination born from trauma and morphine, but then came the pain, real pain, heavy, hot, and everywhere. It dragged him fully awake, and with it came memory, slicing through the fog like a blade, the accident, the brakes, the spin, and then The child, her voice, that whisper through the shattered window, a hand on his chest. It hadn't been a dream. His mouth was dry, his throat sandpapered raw, but he managed to croak out a sound just loud enough to trigger the attention of someone nearby. A nurse appeared within seconds, pressing a button, calling for the doctor. "He's awake," she said, clearly surprised. "Mr. Hale is awake." Voices rose in the hallway. More footsteps. But Richard didn't care about any of that. All he could think about was the girl in the raincoat, her voice. Her words, the ones only Anna had ever spoken. Truth whispers quietly. Listening saves souls from lies. How the hell had a stranger known that? The medical staff moved in like a well-rehearsed orchestra, checking vitals, asking questions, noting his reactions. But it was the tight lines on their faces that Richard noticed first. Not awe, not joy, confusion. The ER physician, a seasoned man in his 50s with reading glasses perched on his nose, flipped through Richard's chart with a furrowed brow. "Your injuries were severe," he said after some time. 4 broken ribs, collapsed lung, concussion, internal bleeding. By all reasonable standards, you should have lost consciousness almost immediately after the crash. Richard stared at him, not trusting his own voice yet. "You stayed alert for over 8 minutes, the doctor continued, voice tight with disbelief. "That doesn't happen. Not with those injuries. Paramedics said you were coherent, responsive, said a child was with you, talking to you." Richard's heart skipped. The doctor glanced up, watching his face closely. "We didn't find any child on the scene when emergency crews arrived. The woman who pulled her away before we got there, she disappeared, but the paramedics said she held your hand and kept you awake." Richard could feel the weight of the words, could hear them echo inside him louder than the heart monitor. A child, holding his hand, whispering his dead wife's words. It made no sense, and yet it was the only thing that made any. Later that afternoon, after a blur of X-rays and test results, Richard sat alone in the room, propped up slightly on a pile of pillows, feeling both more alive and more fractured than he could remember. A tray of untouched food sat cooling beside him. His assistant had called twice. The board wanted updates. There were questions about contracts and meetings. He told them all to wait. He couldn't focus on anything that had once defined him. Not now. Not after this. A nurse had changed his bandages earlier and left behind a small object on the nightstand. At first, Richard hadn't noticed, but when he reached for his water, he saw it. A stuffed animal. A small, well-loved bunny with one ear slightly chewed and the fabric worn thin from years of being held. Next to it was a folded piece of paper. He stared at it for a long time before touching it, afraid of what it might confirm or deny. Slowly, he unfolded the note. The handwriting was clumsy, the letters oversized and uncertain, but it was unmistakably a child's hand. "You were brave. Get better soon. Clara." That name. Clara. His breath caught. His fingers gripped the paper like it might vanish. It was real. She was real. He didn't realize how long he'd been staring at the note until the door creaked open again. This time it wasn't a doctor or a nurse. It was his assistant, Marcus, carrying a leather folder filled with contracts and liability paperwork. Richard barely looked at it. "Not now," he said, voice hoarse but firm. Marcus hesitated. "Sir, I said not now." There was no anger in his voice, just finality. Marcus backed away, confused, murmuring something about returning tomorrow. When the door closed again, Richard looked back at the bunny and the note, and something inside him began to shift. Clara, 7 years old, judging by the writing, in a wheelchair. A child who had no reason to approach a wreck like that, no business getting close to a dying man, yet she had. And somehow, impossibly, she had known exactly what to say, not comforting words, not encouragement, but Anna's words. Truth whispers quietly. Listening saves souls from lies. Words he had never spoken aloud to anyone. Words from a journal he had locked in a drawer the night after the funeral and never opened again. That child, Clara, had reached into his death and pulled something back. Not just breath, not just heartbeat, something deeper. He tried to piece it together rationally. Maybe Clara's mother had known Anna. Maybe she'd read the journal somehow. But that was absurd. Anna had never shared it. Richard had never quoted it publicly. No one even knew the journal existed. The idea that a random girl had recited those words without knowing their origin, it felt impossible. And yet, here he was, alive, awake, with a note in his hand from the same child who had whispered the impossible through shattered glass. The doctors could not explain his survival. The machines had done what they could. The paramedics had acted fast, but no one had an answer for why his brain had refused to shut down, why he had held on so long. No one but Clara. And somehow that mattered more than any medical record. Richard leaned back against the pillows, breathing carefully through bruised lungs. His mind should have been racing, but it wasn't. It was quiet, not silent like before, but still, focused. For the first time in years, something felt real. He folded the note again gently and placed it beside the stuffed bunny. He didn't know who Clara really was, not yet, but he intended to find out. Richard awoke in the hospital with severe injuries, but miraculously remained conscious long enough to survive. The doctors couldn't explain how he lasted so long. Then he received a handwritten letter and a stuffed bunny from Clara, a 7-year-old girl in a wheelchair, who had found him after the crash and spoken to him. Her words weren't ordinary. They were familiar, deeply personal. Words only his late wife Anna had ever said. That mystery, that voice, was the only reason Richard Hale was still alive. And now he couldn't stop thinking about her. Richard hadn't expected to see her again so soon, much less in such an ordinary moment. He had been resting, recovering slowly from his injuries, flipping absent-mindedly through a book left on the nightstand, a well-worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are, when the door to his hospital room creaked open. He looked up, expecting a nurse, maybe his assistant, but instead a small figure rolled in, her hands moving expertly along the wheels of her chair. Clara. Her name hit him like a quiet explosion. She was wearing a denim dress this time, her yellow raincoat nowhere in sight, and her blonde hair was braided with precision, as if someone had taken real care that morning. She beamed when she saw him awake. "You're not dead," she announced matter-of-factly. He couldn't help the soft chuckle that escaped his throat. "Not yet, apparently," he replied. Clara rolled herself closer, placing her favorite book on his lap without asking. "You looked sad on the news," she said, settling in as if this were the most normal visit in the world. "That book helped me when I was sad." Richard looked at the worn cover and felt his throat tighten. That very book had once belonged in a nursery he never got to use. Before he could respond, a voice sliced through the moment like a blade. "Clara!" A woman stood at the doorway, breathless, panicked, her eyes wide with something between horror and disbelief. She had auburn hair pulled into a neat ponytail and wore nurse's scrubs with a name badge clipped to her chest, Hannah Jensen. Richard looked at her, confused for a half second, until recognition slammed into him. Her face. It had changed in subtle ways, but not enough to erase the memory. He remembered her now, a night years ago, a gala, laughter, one drink too many, and then nothing. He hadn't seen her since. But the moment her eyes locked on his, her face paled. "What is she doing here?" she demanded, moving quickly to Clara's side. Clara, unbothered, simply pointed at the book on Richard's lap. "He looked like he needed it," she said, still calm. Hannah's hands trembled as she took the handles of the wheelchair. "We need to go." Richard sat up straighter. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly sharper. You're her mother." Hannah's expression froze. "We need to go," she repeated. but her voice had lost some of its certainty. Richard stared between them, 1,000 puzzle pieces rearranging themselves in his mind. The timeline, the resemblance, the night. Hannah tried to steer Clara out of the room, but Richard swung his legs slowly over the side of the bed, ignoring the stab of pain in his ribs. "Don't," he said, quiet but commanding. "Don't walk away without telling me the truth." Hannah stopped. Clara turned her head slightly, sensing the tension but saying nothing. "Is she mine?" Richard asked. The words felt heavier than any contract he had ever signed, any merger he had ever negotiated. Hannah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder and knelt beside her. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "why don't you wait just outside for a moment?" "Right by the window where I can see you?" Clara frowned. "But I'm not finished explaining the monster parts in the book." Hannah forced a smile. "You will, I promise. Just 5 minutes." Clara rolled out reluctantly, giving Richard a small wave before disappearing. Then Hannah closed the door behind her and turned. Her composure cracked the second it was just the two of them. "Yes," she whispered. "She's yours." Richard felt the world narrow around that single sentence. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice was strained. Hannah crossed her arms tightly, as if bracing herself for impact. "Because you were grieving, Richard. Because you were a ghost. I called, once, months after the gala. You didn't answer. I thought about pushing harder, but I saw the headlines. I saw the photos. You were drowning in grief. Your wife had just died, and I wasn't going to be the woman who forced herself into that story. I wasn't going to be a complication." Richard tried to respond, but no words came. "And when Clara was born," Hannah continued, "I decided I would raise her on my own. Not because I hated you, not because I wanted to keep her from you, but because you looked like a man who'd already lost everything, and I didn't want her to become something else you resented." The accusation wasn't cruel. It was exhausted, worn out from years of carrying something alone. Richard pressed a hand to his forehead, the weight of realization almost unbearable. "But I should have known," he muttered. "She looks like you," Hannah finished. "She has your eyes. She has your stubbornness. But she has my mother's heart." That last part caught him. "Your mother," he echoed. "She died recently. That's who Clara was quoting in the car. Her grandmother raised her on those sayings." I never realized they were Anna's words too. He thought of Clara kneeling in the glass, speaking words no one else knew. He thought of the book in her lap, once read aloud in a nursery, filled with hope, and now placed in his hands as if time had folded in on itself. He thought of Hannah carrying this secret, this life for 7 years, believing it was kindness to keep it from him. Maybe, in a twisted way, it had been, but he couldn't pretend it didn't hurt. "She saved my life," he said, looking at Hannah with something raw in his voice. "And I didn't even know her name until today." Hannah's eyes welled with tears, but she nodded. "I know. And I didn't plan for this. I didn't expect fate to collide like this. But you know now." Richard nodded slowly. "I want to know her. I'm not going to stop you," Hannah said quietly. "But don't come into her life unless you're going to stay. She's too smart, Richard. She'll see through anything less than the truth." He looked toward the door where Clara waited. A strange, new kind of fear crept into him, not of death, but of being someone's father, of being needed. Richard had re-encountered Clara in the hospital and felt something stir inside him he couldn't explain. The connection was too real, too deep. And when her mother, Hannah, a nurse, appeared and panicked at the sight of them together, it all began to make sense. Upon confronting her, Richard learned the truth. Clara was his biological daughter, the result of a single night years ago. Hannah had kept it from him, believing he wasn't ready to be a father in the midst of his grief. And maybe she had been right. But now, with the truth out in the open, Richard couldn't unsee what he now knew. He was a father, and the miracle girl who saved him wasn't a stranger at all. Richard didn't know what to expect when Clara returned to his hospital room that afternoon. He was sitting upright, mind spinning with what he had learned, what had been revealed, what had been withheld, still reeling from the truth that the girl who had saved his life was, in fact, his daughter. When Clara wheeled herself in, wearing that same quiet confidence that now struck him as genetic, he put down the folder of untouched documents in his lap and gave her his full attention. She didn't hesitate. She placed a different book in his lap this time, one about dragons, and settled beside him with the ease of someone who had known him forever. "You still don't look okay," she said plainly. Richard smiled, or tried to. "I've been through a lot," he said. She looked up at him with eyes too old for her age. "That's not what I mean." Her hand touched his, just lightly. "You look like Mom does when she thinks I'm asleep and starts crying." Richard's breath caught. There was something in her voice, something unsettlingly precise. Before he could respond, she added, "You heard me in the car because you were listening for something true. That's what Grandma used to say, real truth whispers. But you have to be quiet enough to hear it." They sank in slowly, word by word, as if his brain didn't want to believe what he'd heard, but he had heard them. Real truth whispers. You have to be quiet enough to hear it. His heart stumbled. "What did you say?" he asked, trying to stay steady, but Clara was already pulling something from the small pouch hanging on the side of her wheelchair. A folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it, and inside were handwritten phrases, scribbled in crayon but unmistakably familiar. His late wife's words. Phrases Anna used to write in her journals, lines she'd never published, never shared beyond their bedroom and her private thoughts. Lines like "Noise is the enemy of knowing," and "Sorrow speaks in riddles, but truth just waits patiently." He felt the breath leave his lungs in a way that wasn't pain, but something deeper. Clara watched him without blinking. "Grandma told Mom those things. Mom tells me. I thought they were just ours, but they're yours too." Richard couldn't speak. The connection threaded itself through time, grief, blood, and something almost spiritual. He remembered finding Anna's journal after the funeral and locking it away, unable to face what it meant. And now his daughter, was quoting it back to him like some cosmic echo. Hannah entered the room quietly, clearly nervous about interrupting, but froze when she saw the paper in Richard's hand. Her face went pale. "Where did she began, voice low. Richard didn't look at her right away. He was still staring at the page, fingers trembling, memories unraveling everything he had kept sealed. "You gave these to Clara?" he asked finally. Hannah nodded slowly, walking over. "They were from my mother. She wrote them down after hearing them from Anna. She kept a journal too. Said those words helped her when things were hard. After she died, I gave them to Clara because they felt like anchors." Richard finally looked up at her. "You didn't know where they came from?" "No," Hannah said softly. "I had no idea they were Anna's. I never made the connection until now." Clara looked between them. "You're both really quiet. That means it's a truth moment, right?" Hannah gave a weak laugh, but Richard didn't smile. His voice was low, more vulnerable than Hannah had ever heard it. "I buried her. And I buried all of this with her. Everything good, everything true. I shut it down so I wouldn't drown. And now it's coming back through a little girl who should never have had to carry any of it. Shame, not for what he lost, but for what he refused to hold on to." He looked at Hannah and saw not just the woman who had once been a memory he tried to forget, but the person who had carried forward something sacred without even knowing it. She'd passed down the legacy of the woman he loved, not by force, but by instinct, and Clara, impossibly, had embodied it. "You weren't supposed to carry this," he said, his voice cracking as he looked at Clara. "You weren't supposed to be the one who reminded me how to feel." Clara didn't look sad or burdened by his words. She simply tilted her head like she was solving a riddle. "It's okay if grown-ups forget," she said. "Kids remember for a while." Hannah swallowed hard, and sat on the edge of the bed. "She's always been like this," she said softly. "She listens differently, talks differently. It's like she sees the pieces we pretend aren't broken." Richard reached for the girl's hand, brushing it gently with his fingers. "You're 7, he said, voice raw. "How do you know these things?" Clara shrugged. "I don't know how, I just do. Grandma said love stays in the air after people leave. Maybe that's where I hear it from." It felt earned, like something sacred was finally being acknowledged. "I've done nothing for 7 years but hide from the fact that I lost everything," Richard admitted. "And I didn't even know that what I lost wasn't gone. It just changed form. I thought Anna's death was the end of every good thing, but then you," he looked at Clara, "you brought it back. Not just with your voice, but your presence, your truth." Hannah said nothing. Her eyes were full, but she didn't interrupt. Clara took a deep breath. "Sometimes I get scared that I'll forget Grandma's voice, so I say her words out loud a lot. They feel like they keep her here." Richard nodded slowly. "They do. They really do." Hannah exhaled. "Maybe that's why she found you," she said, turning to him. "She felt your silence, and she couldn't let it stay that way. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something close, the beginning of a bridge that none of them knew how to build, but all of them desperately needed. For the first time, the pain wasn't just pain, it was movement. A shifting toward something unfamiliar but honest, toward family. Clara, with her strange and beautiful wisdom, had spoken words that Anna once wrote in her private journal, words no one else should have known. But somehow, they lived on through her. And through those words, Richard was forced to face the grief he had buried for years, the wife he lost, the child he didn't know, and the truth he had been too broken to accept. It hurt. God, it hurt. But somehow, in that pain, something new began. A connection, a thread, a fragile start to something real between the three of them, despite the wounds, despite the years, and despite the shadows of everything they never said. Vivian Lane stood outside Richard's hospital room, her expression carefully arranged in neutrality, but her eyes told a far different story. From the moment she heard whispers that Richard had survived the crash, her plans began to unravel. The man was supposed to be dead. The brake failure had been orchestrated down to the last detail, silent, untraceable, and convenient. She'd mourned publicly, played the grieving ex-partner, and was already negotiating her way into the boardroom as the next natural leader of Hale Industries. But Richard had the indecency to survive. Worse, he had started attracting attention with something the media was calling a miracle. Some child had saved him, some touching story about fate and redemption. Vivian didn't believe in miracles. She believed in power, leverage, and the usefulness of accidents. From her quiet vantage point, she watched as the girl in the wheelchair, Clara, exited Richard's room, pushing herself with surprising control for someone so small. Vivian narrowed her eyes. That girl was becoming a problem. She wasn't just some random bystander. People were calling her a hero. The press loved her. Richard clearly adored her. And from what Vivian had begun to piece together, there was something deeper. Blood, maybe. A connection she could weaponize or destroy. Vivian knew how to manipulate. She'd spent years perfecting it in conference rooms and investor dinners, using charm as a scalpel and silence as a trap. Now, she redirected those same tools toward a child. Clara was clever, yes, but still a child. That meant she was vulnerable to kindness, to stories, to the illusion of trust. The opportunity came days later in the hospital garden, where Clara often sat in the afternoons while Hannah worked. Vivian approached with carefully measured warmth. "Hello there," she said, crouching beside Clara's wheelchair. "I saw your story on the news. You're even braver in person." Clara looked up, slightly unsure. "Do I know you?" Vivian smiled gently. "No, but I knew your dad. A long time ago. We were friends. I used to help him with important things." Clara blinked. "My dad?" she asked. Vivian nodded. "Richard, he's your dad, isn't he?" Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "He doesn't say it a lot, but yes." Vivian softened her voice further. "He's lucky to have you. I just wanted to say, sometimes grown-ups don't always tell the whole truth. Not because they're bad, just because they're scared." Clara tilted her head. "Scared of what?" Vivian leaned closer. "Of what happens when someone new becomes more important than the past." The seed was planted. The next time Richard saw Clara, she was more distant, still kind, still curious, but guarded in subtle ways. He noticed the way she paused before speaking, the hesitation before taking his hand. He tried not to overthink it, assuming she was just tired or overwhelmed, but the pattern continued. Hannah noticed too. "She's pulling back," she told Richard quietly one evening. "She's asking questions like, if she broke something by being born." That sentence pierced him. "What?" he asked, stunned. Hannah nodded, clearly struggling. "She asked me if Anna would have been mad to know about her. If you only started loving her because she reminds you of someone you lost." Richard felt sick. None of those thoughts came from Clara. They had been put there, manipulated into place. But who? How? It didn't take long to find out. A nurse casually mentioned seeing Clara talking with that stylish blonde woman again in the garden, a woman who'd claimed to be Richard's close friend. "Vivian," Richard muttered under his breath. His jaw clenched. He hadn't seen her since the accident, hadn't even thought about her as more than a corporate scavenger. But now she was circling Clara, inserting herself. That crossed every line he had left. It was war. He didn't confront her right away. Richard understood the danger of direct accusations without evidence. Vivian was too slick, too careful. She'd twist it into paranoia, maybe even use it to discredit him further with the board. Instead, he dug. He had his assistant run quiet checks, tapped into hospital visitor logs, and cross-referenced times Clara had been alone with instances of Vivian's presence. The pattern was there. Worse, security footage confirmed it. Vivian had been lurking around Clara's favorite spots, the hospital library, the chapel, the garden. Never threatening, always sweet, and yet always spinning just enough doubt to chip away at trust. "She's manipulating my daughter," Richard said to Hannah, showing her the footage. "She's trying to break us from the inside." Hannah's expression darkened. "Then we stop her. We make sure Clara knows who she really is." But Richard wasn't so sure. Clara wasn't just any child. She absorbed everything. If they moved too aggressively, it could backfire. Vivian would paint herself as the misunderstood adult, and Clara might cling to her out of defiance or confusion. No, this had to be handled surgically, which meant Vivian would have to believe she'd won, right until the moment she lost everything. Vivian, meanwhile, celebrated quietly. The cracks were beginning to show. Clara had started asking the right questions, painful ones, the kind that made a child hesitate when reaching for affection. That was all she needed. Doubt was like mold, invisible at first, but impossible to stop once it took root. If she could get Clara to believe that Richard's love was conditional, rooted in guilt and ghost stories, then the bond would fracture. And once that happened, Vivian could slide in as the truthful adult, the one who wasn't haunted by dead wives or buried regrets. She began preparing her next move, a fabricated letter from Anna's journal, twisted just enough to imply Richard had once resented the idea of children. It would be a cruel lie, but effective. Vivian believed deeply that morality was a luxury for people without ambition. Clara was an obstacle, an innocent one, yes, but still in the way. And when someone stood between Vivian and power, innocence became irrelevant. She had spent too many years in Richard's shadow, tolerated too many slights. This time, she would win. And she would win by breaking him where he was newly vulnerable, as a father. Vivian Lane, Richard's former business partner, had watched everything unfold with jealousy and quiet rage. The accident she orchestrated had failed to eliminate him, and worse, had brought Clara into his life, this little girl who had become both his miracle and his anchor. Vivian now saw her not just as a threat to her control over the company, but as the one force capable of restoring Richard's humanity. And that, to Vivian, was unacceptable. She began weaving her web with precision, drawing closer to Clara under the guise of friendship and mentorship, playing the part of a concerned adult. But behind that polished smile, her intentions were toxic. She was determined to destroy this fragile new family before it could truly begin. Clara wasn't like most children her age. She didn't cry loudly when she was scared or scream when something felt wrong. Instead, she created, in silence. That week, after yet another encounter with Vivian, she began asking Hannah for more paper, more crayons, more markers. She didn't explain why. She just sat at the small table in the hospital's rec room, scribbling until her fingers were sore. The drawings were strange, eyes with no pupils, wide, exaggerated smiles that stretched into sharpness, shadowy figures standing behind stick versions of her in a wheelchair. When Hannah asked what she was drawing, Clara shrugged. "Just stuff I see when I'm thinking," she said. But when Richard saw them, something in him froze. One of the pictures showed a woman who looked unmistakably like Vivian. Blonde hair, red lipstick, eyes too big and empty. In the corner, Clara had written the words, "Liar inside." That wasn't a coincidence. That was a warning, and she had no idea he'd needed one. Clara couldn't articulate it, but her intuition had told her everything she needed to know. Vivian's kindness felt wrong, like something wearing a smile it hadn't earned. So she told the truth, the only way she knew how, through her art. Richard didn't waste time. With the disturbing drawings in hand, he returned to his office earlier than expected, brushing past concerned staff and ignoring board meeting requests. There was a fire in his veins he hadn't felt in years. He didn't need more reason to distrust Vivian. His gut had been screaming since Clara started pulling away, but now he had a lead, something that pointed toward real danger. Clara had drawn fear, manipulation, and deceit. And that meant Vivian had done something concrete. He called a contact in private security, the same firm he used before selling his last international division. "I need a sweep," he said. "Office, home, hospital garage, discreet. And pull surveillance on the accident again." "Something isn't right." Hours later, the call came. "We reviewed the crash footage. Your instincts were right, sir. The brake line was tampered with. Same method as before, but here's the catch. It was done again, a week ago, on your replacement vehicle." Richard went silent. The implications settled in his bones like ice. She hadn't just tried once, she was still trying. And if the second attempt had succeeded, Clara might have been in the car too. That thought ignited something feral in him. Vivian wasn't just targeting him. She was playing with fire around his daughter. He met Hannah in the hospital parking lot the next morning and handed her the report. "She did it again," he said, voice low, trembling with fury. "She tampered with the second car, the one we were going to use for Clara's outpatient transfer." Hannah stared at the pages, her mouth falling open. "She would have killed her," she whispered, "or used her. That's the only other reason to do it. Create a tragedy, paint herself the hero again, sweep in and take over." Richard nodded. "She's using Clara, or planning to." Hannah's hands curled into fists. "She's been alone with her at least 4 times in the last 2 weeks. I thought she was just being manipulative, not—" She couldn't finish. Clara had lost the ability to walk because of a genetic disorder, but now she was under threat from something worse. Human malice disguised as compassion. Richard could feel the old version of himself resurfacing, the one that once knew how to dismantle monsters in business suits. "I won't let her touch Clara again," he said, "and I'm not going to the board, not yet. I want to give Vivian the illusion of control. That's the only way she'll slip. The only way we catch her before she tries again." She brought Clara a book about strong girls in history, offered her little candy boxes with pastel bows, and made veiled comments about how adults were always complicated and sometimes had to make hard choices. Clara listened with narrowed eyes. She wasn't confrontational, but she was paying attention. And when Vivian mentioned almost casually that sometimes people had to be replaced for the good of the group, Clara responded with a question that startled her. "Is that why you don't like my dad smiling again?" Vivian froze only for a second. "What do you mean, darling?" she asked, her voice still honey-sweet. Clara tilted her head. "You look mad when he smiles, and scared when I talk about Grandma Anna. Like you're forgetting what face to wear." The conversation ended there, but Clara went back to her drawings with new energy. This time she drew a mirror. In it, her own reflection smiled. But behind her stood the same woman with hollow eyes and too many teeth, holding scissors, cutting something invisible. In the corner of the page, Clara wrote, "Not real, pretending, danger smile." It was her silent scream, and it was growing louder. Richard found the drawing later that night, tucked under his pillow in the hospital room. He stared at it for long minutes, barely breathing. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was Clara begging him to see it, to act, and he would. He held the page like evidence and called his head of security. "I want her watched around the clock," he said, discreetly. "No direct moves yet. But if she so much as steps into Clara's wing without approval, I want to know before she opens the door." Then he called his lawyer. It was time to prepare an injunction. If Vivian had infiltrated the hospital, his company, and tried twice to sabotage his car, she was no longer just a threat to him. She was a predator. And predators around children were the kind he had no mercy for. The pieces were starting to align. Clara's drawings weren't just emotional expressions. They were strategic. He saw them now as warnings, as traps laid out in crayon. He wasn't sure whether to be proud or heartbroken, but he was grateful. Without her, he never would have seen it clearly. Without her, he might have died. And worse, she might have died too. Now it was his turn to protect her. Clara had seen what no adult could. Her drawings were not just artwork. They were alarms. Warnings from a child too young to name manipulation, but smart enough to recognize danger. Through eyes and grins that felt wrong, through sketches of mirrors that reflected lies, Clara told her truth. Richard understood now. Vivian had never stopped trying to destroy him, and now she was circling Clara like a shark. When the second sabotage was uncovered, everything became clear. Vivian didn't just want control, she wanted silence, permanence. Maybe Clara was bait, or maybe Vivian had realized the girl was the only force strong enough to undo her. One thing was certain now. The threat was no longer subtle. It was real. Clara had screamed, not with noise, but with symbols. And Richard heard her. Vivian's plan was executed with the kind of calm cruelty only someone completely detached from consequence could manage. She waited by the school with a borrowed car and a cast on her wrist. Fake, but convincing. She wore a worried expression and clutched a phone, pretending to be panicked. When Clara saw her, confusion flickered across the girl's face. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her small hands tightening on the armrests of her wheelchair. Vivian crouched beside her, tone soft but urgent. "Your mum slipped and hit her head," she lied smoothly. "She's okay, but she's scared. She kept asking for you. I told her I'd bring you to her. Come on, sweetheart, quickly." Clara hesitated, looking toward the building where she usually waited for Hannah. But the mention of her mother being scared broke down her resistance. "Okay," she whispered, "but just to see her." Vivian nodded, loading her gently into the back seat of the car, securing the straps like a doting relative. The second the door closed, her face changed. The warmth disappeared. She pulled away from the curb without a backward glance. Clara knew then something was very wrong. She turned her head and watched the school fade behind them, her stomach tight with fear. Richard and Hannah discovered Clara was missing within 10 minutes, but every second after that stretched into unbearable dread. Hannah had returned to the school to pick her up, only to find the teachers confused. She left, the receptionist said. With your sister, I think. Blonde woman. Said you were in the hospital. Hannah's heart stopped cold. I don't have a sister, she whispered, but that wasn't true. Not technically, not legally, and not anymore. Vivian, she hissed, sprinting back to the car and calling Richard with shaking hands. She has Clara. That monster took her. Richard was already on his way, and within 15 minutes they were in the office of Dr. Samuel Langford, an old friend and mentor, once a corporate psychologist, now their only strategic mind who could keep calm under extreme pressure. She won't hurt her immediately, Samuel said, thinking aloud. She needs leverage. A child is a tool, not a casualty. If she wanted Clara dead, she wouldn't have staged it. Richard slammed his fist into the wall. Then where would she go? Samuel closed his eyes for a second. Somewhere transitional, hidden but not far. She'll want to stall until she figures out her next move. He opened his eyes and looked at them both. I might know where. Richard, Hannah, and Samuel approached with a mixture of terror and focus. There was no plan beyond rescue, no police, no delay. Just get Clara out. Wait here, Richard ordered Hannah as he and Samuel descended the cracked ramp. They found the car near the far end, parked by a broken service elevator. Vivian was standing beside it, arms crossed, calm as ever. Clara was still inside, visible through the window, her face pressed against the glass. Step away from her, Richard growled, every word laced with fury. Vivian didn't flinch. You're only making this harder than it needs to be, she replied coolly. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I wanted control. You took that from me. Samuel held out a hand. You crossed a line, Vivian. Whatever your motives, this ends now. Walk away while you still can. Vivian's eyes flicked to Clara, then back to Richard. She makes you weak, she spat. You were better when you were broken. You think she's healing you, but she's your downfall. The words hit hard, but not harder than what Clara did next. Inside the car, Clara unbuckled herself and rolled the window down. Her voice was steady, small, but piercing. You're scared, she said to Vivian. You thought taking me would break my dad. But it just shows how afraid you are of him being whole again. Vivian stared at her, disarmed by the composure in the child's voice. You don't know what you're talking about, she snapped. But Clara didn't stop. Yes, I do. You look like Mommy when she used to lie. But she got better. You're stuck in bad. There was silence, heavy and cutting. Then Clara added something that made Vivian physically recoil. You're my aunt, aren't you? Mommy said your name once when she cried. You're her sister. That revelation cracked something open. Hannah, now standing at the top of the ramp, went pale. Clara, she began, voice trembling. Richard turned sharply. Is it true? He demanded. Vivian's expression twisted. It doesn't matter, she snapped. She was weak. You're all weak. But her words had lost their power. The truth was out. The lie exposed, and Clara had spoken it aloud with the clarity only innocence could deliver. Vivian turned away, pacing, her once unshakable confidence fracturing. She wasn't supposed to know, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. That wasn't part of the plan. Richard moved to the car, opened the door, and lifted Clara gently into his arms. She held him tightly, trembling now that the danger had passed. Samuel stepped forward. It's over, Vivian. You're out of cards. But she wasn't listening. She was unraveling. I was the one who kept the family together, she whispered, her tone shifting into bitterness. She got all the love, all the sympathy. And you, she looked at Richard, tears gathering in her eyes. You were supposed to fall. I was supposed to rise. Richard stared at her for the first time, seeing not just a rival or villain, but a deeply broken woman consumed by her own failures. You need help, he said quietly, but you're not getting it near my daughter. She froze. That word daughter landed with finality. It ended her illusion of control. When the authorities arrived, she didn't resist. She just sat on the curb, hands limp in her lap, muttering Clara's name under her breath like a curse, or maybe a prayer. Back at the hospital, Clara clung to her mother and father with silent tears. The trauma hadn't sunk in yet. Not fully, but the strength she'd shown had carried them through the worst. She had spoken the truth in the face of danger. She had seen past manipulation and pain, and in doing so, she'd forced everyone to confront what had long been buried. The kidnapping wasn't just a physical act. It was the final act of Vivian's crumbling delusion. Richard and Hannah held each other in the quiet aftermath, overwhelmed but united. Dr. Samuel stood at the window, watching over them like a sentinel. "She's extraordinary," he said softly. Richard nodded, eyes never leaving Clara. "She saved us again." And she had. With words, not weapons. With questions, not force. In the end, it was Clara who saw clearly. It was Clara who told the truth. And it was Clara who learned that even family could be dangerous. But love, real love, would always find a way through the dark. Vivian sat in the back of the police car, her eyes glassy, her posture slumped in a way that no longer resembled the cold, poised executive she once was. She wasn't crying, at least not outwardly, but the tremble in her fingers as she clenched the seatbelt betrayed the storm inside. The revelation that Clara was her niece had dismantled the mask she wore for years, and now she stared into the rearview mirror as if trying to locate the version of herself that once believed she was in control. Richard and Hannah stood nearby, watching in silence as the officers processed the paperwork. Clara, still seated in her wheelchair, slowly rolled forward, ignoring the quiet protests of a nearby officer. "Let me talk to her," she said gently. Richard took a hesitant step toward her, but Hannah placed a calming hand on his arm. "She needs to," she whispered. Clara reached the car and tapped on the glass. Vivian turned, her expression unreadable. "I hope you get help," Clara said softly. "I know you're angry, but I don't hate you. I just don't want you to stay broken forever." Vivian stared at her niece for a long second. Then silently, she turned away. The drive home was marked by more silence than relief. Richard kept glancing at the rearview mirror as if still expecting someone to tail them. Hannah sat beside Clara, holding her hand tightly, as though afraid that if she let go, their daughter might disappear again. Clara remained quiet for most of the ride, her gaze focused outside the window. When they reached the house, she finally spoke. "Do you think she meant it?" she asked. Richard parked and turned to face her. "Meant what, sweetheart?" Clara hesitated. "When she said we made you weak, did she really think that?" Hannah answered before Richard could. "People who are hurting say things to hurt others, but you made your dad stronger, not weaker. You reminded him how to care." Clara nodded slowly, thoughtful. Inside the house, the familiarity felt heavier. The scars from Vivian's betrayal would take time to fade. But that night, as they sat together on the couch, Hannah curled close to Richard, Clara between them with a book in her lap, they felt something shift. Not relief, not closure, but something closer to peace. And in that stillness, Richard made a decision, one that had been growing since the first time Clara saved his life. 2 weeks later, Richard stood on the steps of the Hale Corporation's main building and faced a crowd of reporters, staff, and confused board members. His suit was tailored, his posture strong, but his expression softer than most had ever seen. "Today," he began, "we are announcing a new initiative, one that reflects not just who I am now, but what this company should stand for moving forward." Behind him, a banner unfurled. The Clara Truth Foundation. The murmurs rippled instantly. He raised a hand. "This foundation will be dedicated to listening to voices that often go unheard, especially children. Children who see what adults ignore, who speak truth without politics, money, or fear getting in the way." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. My daughter Clara saved my life. Not just once, and not just physically. She reminded me what matters, and now it's our turn to make sure that no child's truth is ever dismissed again." Cameras flashed, but Richard only looked down where Clara waited with Hannah at the bottom of the steps. When he opened his arms, Clara rolled forward, her smile steady and wide. He scooped her up, chair and all, and carried her onto the stage. Applause erupted. The launch event for the foundation was more than symbolic. Over the following days, media coverage highlighted the transparency of Richard's change. He spoke openly about his past mistakes, the emotional detachment, the tunnel vision pursuit of power, the years of silence after his wife's death. But the interviews always returned to Clara. "She asked a question no adult had ever dared ask me," he said in one segment. "She asked why I looked sad when I smiled. That broke something in me, and then it built something better." Hannah, once hesitant to re-enter the public eye, found herself standing beside Richard on talk shows and panels. "This isn't just about healing a company," she said during one interview. "It's about healing a man, a family, and maybe showing others how." Clara, though kept away from the intense spotlight, became a symbol of resilience across the country. Schools began partnering with the foundation, implementing listening programs where students could speak without fear of punishment. Therapists and educators contributed strategies. But at home, Clara remained the same child, curious, thoughtful, brave. She didn't need fame. She only wanted her parents to stay beside her. That was enough. Richard's office looked different now. The cold, minimalist style was gone, replaced by Clara's drawings, framed and proud on the walls. One showed their family holding hands. Another depicted a building labeled Truth, surrounded by hearts and stars. Richard often caught himself staring at them between meetings. He no longer saw numbers first, he saw people. When his assistant brought in a report on the foundation's early impact, she smiled. "You've built something real, sir," he nodded. "I didn't build it alone." Then he asked her to schedule a boardroom visit for a group of students next week. "Let them see what it's like. Let them speak." Unfiltered. That afternoon, he walked to the hospital wing that had once been Clara's second home and personally thanked each nurse. "You kept her safe when I didn't even know how much she meant to me," he said to one. Gratitude flowed from him like a language newly learned, and Hannah noticed. "You're different," she told him one night as they tucked Clara in. Richard kissed Clara's forehead. "I'm finally becoming the man I promised your mother I would be. The one you both deserve." A small school auditorium, folding chairs, a temporary stage. The final part of the foundation's launch was a symbolic act. Clara's first public speech. Richard and Hannah stood behind her, their presence quiet but strong. Clara rolled to the microphone with a confidence that had nothing to do with mobility and everything to do with heart. She looked at the audience, a mix of parents, educators, and other children. Then she smiled. "People think kids don't see the truth," she began. "But we do. We just say it in smaller voices." A pause. "Sometimes adults forget how to listen, but I believe they can learn again. My daddy did." She looked back at him, and he blinked away tears. "Even when you're scared, even when you've been hurt. Love can fix things." The crowd stood, applauding, not because she had spoken like an adult, but because she had spoken like a child who had survived, seen, and forgiven. Richard and Hannah joined her at the front. They held her hands, and together they bowed. Clara's smile didn't fade. And in that moment it was clear. The end of their pain wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of everything. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to Mr. Edward's Tales, and drop a comment telling us what part touched you the most. And hey, share this with someone who'd love a story about healing, truth, and second chances. See you in the next tale.